Ethan's boots sank slightly into the damp jungle floor as he pushed through the dense alien foliage. The air was thick with moisture, carrying an eerie scent of something both floral and decayed. Every step he took sent small creatures scurrying away, their bioluminescent bodies flickering in the darkness. The planet was nothing like Earth. Trees stretched high into the sky, their leaves a deep blue, and the ground pulsed faintly, as if the very land itself was alive. His pulse was steady, his breathing controlled, but deep down, something gnawed at him, a feeling he couldn't shake. He wasn't alone. The silence shattered with a scream. It cut through the humid air like a blade, raw and filled with terror. Ethan froze. He had spent enough time in combat to recognize the sound. Someone was in pain. Someone was pleading. His muscles tensed as he turned his head in the direction of the cry, his instincts screaming at him to move. He adjusted the grip on his pulse rifle, stepping lightly, careful not to disturb the thick undergrowth. Whatever was happening, it wasn't far. Pushing forward, he moved swiftly but cautiously, his eyes scanning for movement. The jungle thinned ahead, revealing a break in the trees. Through the gaps, he saw flickering light. Fire. The rhythmic pounding of drums followed, a deep, guttural sound that made the ground tremble beneath his feet. He dropped into a crouch and crept forward, staying hidden in the thick shadows. A tribal village stretched out before him. Dozens of crude wooden structures stood in a wide clearing, their jagged frames illuminated by the glow of torches. The air smelled of burning wood and something else, something sickly sweet, like charred flesh. Ethan's eyes darted across the scene, taking in the massive figures that moved through the village. They were aliens, no doubt, but unlike anything he had encountered before. Towering, muscular beings with thick, ridged skin, their eyes glowing faintly in the firelight. Some carried long spears, their tips gleaming with a liquid that dripped onto the ground, sizzling as it touched the dirt. At the center of the village, tied between two towering poles, was the source of the screams. An alien girl, bound at the wrists, her body suspended above a roaring fire. Her silver-white hair hung down, catching the light as she struggled against the thick ropes that cut into her arms. Her eyes, large and luminous, were filled with pure terror. She thrashed, crying out in a language Ethan didn't understand, her voice hoarse from desperation. The flames beneath her licked at the air, growing hotter, hungrier, as the tribal warriors chanted and raised their weapons. Ethan clenched his jaw. His fingers tightened around his rifle. He had seen many horrors in his time. But this was something else. A sacrifice. A ritual. The girl was seconds away from being burned alive. His mind raced. Charging in would be suicide. There were too many of them, and even with his weapon, he'd be overwhelmed in moments. He needed a plan, a distraction, something to turn the odds in his favor. He scanned the village, noting the weak points. The torches, the wooden structures, the vines wrapped around the trees above. If he could start a fire somewhere else, draw their attention away for even a moment. The girl screamed again, her body jerking violently as one of the warriors stepped forward, raising a jagged blade. The firelight reflected off the metal, its sharp edge gleaming in the night. Ethan exhaled slowly. There was no time for a perfect plan. He moved. Shifting through the shadows, he reached into his belt, pulling free a small spherical device. With a quick press of his thumb, the tiny charge activated, blinking rapidly. He hurled it toward the nearest hut, and as soon as it struck, the explosion rocked the village. The tribe roared in confusion as the structure burst into flames, sending debris flying. Smoke curled into the sky, and for a brief moment, all eyes turned toward the sudden chaos. That was all he needed. Ethan sprinted forward, closing the distance between him and the fire. The girl's wide eyes locked onto him, confusion flashing across her face as he raised his rifle and fired a precise shot. The ropes snapped, and her body fell. He lunged, catching her just before she hit the fire. The heat burned against his skin, but he ignored it, pulling her close as he turned to run. The warriors roared, their trance broken, their fury now directed at him. A deep, guttural howl filled the air, and Ethan's stomach clenched. Something massive was moving beyond the trees. Something was coming. Ethan tightened his grip on the alien girl as he sprinted away from the fire, his boots pounding against the hard-packed dirt. The heat from the flames seared the back of his neck, but he pushed forward, weaving through the chaos he had created. The explosion had sent the villagers into a frenzy. Some were scrambling to put out the spreading fire, while others had already turned their attention to him, their guttural roars echoing through the night. A spear whistled past his ear, burying itself into a wooden post just inches from his head. Another followed, slamming into the ground near his foot, kicking up a cloud of dust. The warriors were fast. Too fast. Ethan's heart pounded as he ducked behind a stack of crude wooden crates, shifting the alien girl's weight so she was secure in his arms. She was barely conscious, her breathing ragged, her body trembling against him. Up close, he could see faint bruises along her arms and dirt smeared across her pale skin. Whatever they had done to her, she had been suffering for a long time. Her glowing eyes fluttered open, dazed but locked onto his. "Hold on," he muttered under his breath, but he wasn't sure if she understood. He peeked over the crates, scanning for an escape route. The village was surrounded by dense jungle, the only visible exit being the same narrow path he had come through. But the warriors were closing in fast, cutting off every possible way out. A deep, bone-rattling growl sent a shiver down his spine. It came from beyond the fire, from the dark edge of the jungle where the flickering flames couldn't quite reach. Something massive shifted in the shadows, the sound of heavy footfalls shaking the ground. The warriors suddenly halted their chase. A tense silence followed, broken only by the crackling of burning wood and the whispering wind that carried an unnatural chill. The warriors, who just moments ago had been relentless in their pursuit, were now frozen, gripping their weapons tightly, their glowing eyes wide with something Ethan had yet to see in them. Fear. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to move. Whatever had emerged from the darkness was far worse than the warriors trying to kill him. He adjusted his grip on the girl and made a split-second decision. He couldn't go back through the village, and he couldn't stay out in the open. That left only one option: the trees. With a grunt, he pushed forward, running straight for the dense foliage. The warriors barely reacted, too focused on the shadowed figure moving beyond the flames. Ethan didn't hesitate to take advantage of their distraction. He jumped over a fallen log and plunged into the jungle, the thick undergrowth whipping against his body as he ran. Behind him, the silence shattered. A monstrous roar, deep and guttural, filled the night air, shaking the very ground beneath his feet. The sound was unlike anything Ethan had ever heard, animalistic, but intelligent. A predator announcing itself. The warriors screamed. Ethan didn't turn back. He forced himself to keep running, even as his lungs burned and his legs ached from the weight of the girl in his arms. Branches snapped around him, the jungle alive with movement. Whatever had been lurking in the darkness was coming, and fast. The girl stirred, her fingers weakly clutching at his shirt. She tried to speak, her voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. Don't." Ethan glanced down but didn't slow his pace. "Don't what?" She swallowed hard, her breath uneven. "Don't. Let it see us." His blood ran cold. The meaning behind her words sank in quickly. Whatever was chasing them, she knew what it was. And if she was afraid of it, even after everything she had endured, then it was something truly terrifying. But running blindly through an unfamiliar jungle wasn't a solution. He needed cover. He needed a place to regroup, to figure out what the hell he had just walked into. A massive tree loomed ahead, its roots stretching out like grasping fingers. Large, broad leaves draped over its trunk, creating a dark canopy that provided perfect concealment. Ethan didn't hesitate. He slid beneath the thick roots, pressing his back against the rough bark. pulling the girl close beside him. His pulse thundered in his ears. He forced his breathing to slow, his body tense as he listened. The jungle was eerily quiet. Then, in the distance, something moved. It was subtle at first, a slow, deliberate sound, like claws dragging against stone. Then another step, and another. Whatever it wasn't running after them. It was stalking them. Ethan barely breathed as he risked a glance through the gaps in the foliage. A massive shape moved through the trees, just beyond the village. It was barely visible in the darkness, its body blending in with the shadows. But its eyes, two glowing, golden orbs, pierced through the night. Ethan had seen predators before, had fought against creatures that made men look small. But this was different. This wasn't just an animal. It was something worse, something that enjoyed the hunt. A cold sweat dripped down his back as he watched it move, its muscles shifting beneath sleek, dark skin. It had an elongated body, its limbs too long, too fluid in their motion. A tail curled behind it, twitching slightly, its sharpened tip dragging through the dirt. Its nostrils flared, and for a moment, Ethan swore it was smelling the air, looking for them. The alien girl's fingers dug into his arm, and he felt her tremble against him. The creature took another step, its head tilted slightly, as if listening. Then, without warning, it lunged. Ethan's heart stopped. But it wasn't lunging at them. It was attacking the warriors. Screams filled the jungle as the monstrous predator tore through the village, its movements impossibly fast, its claws slicing through flesh with horrifying ease. Ethan couldn't see the full extent of the carnage, but he heard it. The sickening crunch of bone. The panicked cries cut short. The crackling of fire as chaos consumed the once powerful warriors. The girl turned her face away, squeezing her eyes shut as her body shook. Ethan didn't blame her. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't just hunting. It was slaughtering. And if they made even the smallest noise, they would be next. Ethan stayed completely still beneath the massive tree roots, his breath shallow as he listened to the horror unfolding beyond the thick jungle foliage. The screams of the tribal warriors were growing fainter, one by one, replaced by sickening crunches and the eerie sound of something heavy dragging across the ground. Whatever that creature was, it was efficient. It didn't kill for survival, it killed for the thrill of it. The alien girl beside him trembled violently, her glowing eyes squeezed shut, her hands clutched into tight fists. She was trying to control her breathing, but even in the dim light, Ethan could see the sheer terror in her face. He couldn't blame her. He had fought in wars, seen men reduced to broken shells after battles, but nothing had ever put ice in his veins the way that creature did. There was something unnatural about it, the way it moved, the way it seemed to know where its prey was before it even struck. Then, the jungle fell silent again. Ethan didn't move. He barely allowed himself to blink. Silence didn't mean safety. It meant the predator was waiting, watching. The girl shifted slightly, barely tilting her head, her breath gasping against Ethan's arm as she whispered, "We have to go. Now." Ethan glanced at her, noting the urgency in her voice. She knew this thing, understood how it hunted. He didn't ask questions. Instead, he nodded and slowly, carefully, shifted into a crouch, keeping his weight balanced. The jungle stretched ahead, a dark maze of twisted roots, towering trees, and thick undergrowth. It was their only option. He adjusted his grip on his rifle and held out a hand to the girl. She hesitated for only a second before taking it, her fingers cold against his skin. They moved together, slow at first, slipping between the massive trees without disturbing a single leaf. Every step was precise, calculated. Ethan kept his ears sharp, listening for the faintest sound of movement behind them. Then, just as they reached a break in the foliage, the girl froze. Ethan felt her body go rigid, her fingers tightening around his hand like a vice. He followed her gaze, his own breath catching in his throat. The creature was there, standing between them and their only path forward. It was even larger up close, its sleek, dark body shifting as it tilted its head slightly, its golden eyes locking onto them like a predator toying with its prey. It stood on all fours, but Ethan could tell it wasn't limited to that form. It had an unnatural flexibility, like it could move however it wanted, whenever it wanted. Its nostrils flared again, taking in their scent. Then it let out a slow, deliberate exhale. It wasn't rushing toward them. It was waiting. It knew they were trapped. Ethan's mind raced. Firing his weapon was an option, but considering how easily it had torn through the warriors back in the village, he doubted bullets would do much more than piss it off. Running was suicide. The jungle was too dense, and this thing was built for speed. Then, without warning, the girl took a step forward. Ethan immediately grabbed her wrist. "Are you insane?" he hissed under his breath. She didn't look at him. Her glowing eyes were locked onto the creature's. And the creature wasn't attacking. Instead, it let out a deep guttural sound. Not a growl, but something closer to a purr. Ethan's grip on his weapon tightened as he watched the strange interaction unfold. The girl knew this thing, or at least it recognized her. She slowly lifted her hands, palms facing outward, her voice calm but filled with quiet authority. "I am not your enemy." The creature's ears twitched. For the first time, it hesitated. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to pull her back, to run, but something in the air shifted. The energy between them was strange, charged with something he couldn't explain. Then, the girl took another step closer. The creature let out a slow breath, its golden eyes narrowing. Then, with a low rumble, it stepped back. Ethan's heart pounded as he realized what had just happened. She had calmed it. The creature gave one final look before turning, disappearing into the darkness of the jungle like a phantom. The girl swayed slightly, exhaustion taking over her body. Ethan caught her before she could collapse. "You want to explain what the hell just happened?" She took a shaky breath. "That was a guardian." Ethan frowned. "A guardian?" She nodded weakly. "They are protectors, but also executioners. They were created to guard something important." Ethan's mind reeled. Created? This thing wasn't just some wild animal. It had a purpose, a mission. His gaze shifted toward the direction the creature had disappeared. If it was a guardian, what exactly was it protecting? The girl clutched his sleeve, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to leave. The real danger is ahead." Ethan didn't ask questions this time. He just helped her to her feet and started moving again. Whatever lay ahead, it was something even a monster like that wasn't allowed to kill without permission. Ethan moved through the dense jungle, his pulse steady but his mind racing. The girl leaned against him, still weak from whatever ordeal she had been through, but she didn't slow them down. She had just faced a monster that should have torn them apart, yet somehow she had controlled it, or at least convinced it not to kill them. That meant something. But there was something else bothering him. The creature, the guardian, as she called it, had let them go, but it hadn't simply disappeared. It had withdrawn. That meant there was something up ahead that even it wasn't willing to touch, something even more dangerous than a predator built for the hunt. The jungle grew darker, the thick canopy above blocking out the alien sky. Strange vines pulsed faintly with an eerie glow, casting shifting green light across Ethan's skin. The air smelled different here, charged, like the air before a storm. The girl stopped suddenly. Ethan glanced at her. She stood completely still, her glowing eyes fixed on something just beyond the next cluster of trees. Her breathing slowed, and she whispered just loud enough for him to hear. "We're here." Ethan followed her gaze. At first, all he saw was more jungle. Tangled trees, thick undergrowth, twisting vines. But then the air shifted again. It was subtle, but Ethan had spent too many years fighting in hostile environments not to notice. There was something wrong with the space ahead. It wasn't natural. Then he saw it. A structure, half buried beneath layers of vines and dirt. Its ancient stone surface cracked but unmistakably artificial. The ruins stretched out before them, massive pillars rising from the jungle floor like the ribs of some forgotten beast. At the center, an enormous archway loomed, black as obsidian, its surface shimmering faintly as though resisting the passage of time. Ethan exhaled slowly. This wasn't just some lost temple. This was something old, something deliberate. The girl hesitated before taking a careful step forward, her fingers brushing against the stone. The moment she touched it, the air around them hummed. A deep vibration coursed through the ground, rattling Ethan's teeth. Then the ruins responded. Faint lines of golden light surged across the stone, illuminating symbols that had long been hidden beneath moss and dirt. The glowing veins pulsed once, twice, before steadying, as if the entire structure had just awakened from an ancient slumber. Ethan immediately stepped back, raising his rifle on instinct. "I'm gonna guess this wasn't part of the plan." The girl turned to him, her expression unreadable. This was always part of the plan. Before Ethan could question her, a deep tremor ran through the ground. Stone groaned as the archway pulsed with a dangerous energy. And suddenly, the jungle around them wasn't silent anymore. A guttural sound rumbled from deep within the ruins. It wasn't mechanical, nor was it alive in any conventional sense. It was something in between, something awakening. Ethan stepped forward, shielding the girl instinctively as the air thickened with something almost tangible, a force pressing down on them, pulling at his lungs. His vision swam for a moment before he forced himself to stay focused. The girl looked at the archway, her eyes filled with something Ethan hadn't seen before: dread. "They know we're here," she whispered. The jungle erupted. From the treetops, dark figures dropped down, their bodies moving unnaturally fast. They weren't like the warriors Ethan had fought in the village. These were something else entirely. Their limbs were too long, their joints moving in strange, fluid motions. Their skin was black as the void, shifting like liquid. Their eyes, if they even had eyes, glowed with the same golden hue as the ruins. They weren't living creatures. They were guardians of a different kind. Ethan didn't hesitate. He lifted his rifle and fired. The pulse round struck the nearest figure, sending it stumbling back, but it didn't fall. Instead, the wound closed instantly, the liquid-like skin reforming, as though he had never hit it. "Not good," he muttered. The creatures didn't hesitate either. They moved, faster than anything Ethan had ever seen, their bodies blurring as they closed the distance between them. Ethan barely had time to react before one was on him. He twisted, using his rifle as a barrier, but the creature's arm reshaped itself, morphing into something bladed, striking at him with terrifying precision. He barely dodged, the blade grazing past his ribs, the cold sensation lingering even through his armor. The girl wasn't just standing by. She lifted her hands, and for the first time, Ethan saw her use whatever power she had hinted at before. A pulse of light erupted from her palms, striking one of the creatures mid-lunge. It didn't stop them completely, but it made them hesitate, their shifting forms glitching for a moment, as if struggling to hold their shape. "Run," she shouted. Ethan didn't argue. He grabbed her wrist and bolted toward the archway. The ruins trembled again, the golden light intensifying, as if reacting to them. The creatures recovered quickly, their distorted forms regaining control as they resumed the chase. The archway was closer now, pulsing with some unreadable energy. Ethan had no idea what would happen when they reached it, but staying here wasn't an option. The girl suddenly stopped running. Ethan nearly yanked her forward but caught himself. "Are you kidding me? We have to." She lifted her hands, and the ruins answered her. The golden veins running across the stone flared brightly, and suddenly, the air ripped open. The distortion, a doorway of sorts, appeared in the center of the archway, shifting like liquid metal. Ethan barely had time to process what was happening before she grabbed his hand and pulled him through. The world vanished. For a brief, terrifying moment, there was nothing. No sound, no air, no light. just an endless void, stretching in all directions. Then, as quickly as it had disappeared, the world returned. But they weren't in the jungle anymore. They stood in a massive chamber, far beneath the surface. The walls shimmered with the same golden energy, but here it was stronger, almost overpowering. Ethan's breath came in sharp, uneven gasps as he turned to the girl. What the hell was that? She looked at him, her expression grave. The beginning. The ruins trembled again. Something else was waking up. The chamber they found themselves in was vast. So vast, in fact, that the edges of the room seemed to dissolve into the shadows, the darkness stretching farther than Ethan could see. The walls were covered in strange symbols, etched in glowing gold, flickering like the pulse of a heartbeat. A faint hum filled the air, vibrating through his bones, as if the room itself was alive, aware of their presence. It felt like they had crossed some boundary, like they weren't just in a different place, but a different time. Ethan's heart was still racing. The adrenaline from the chase hadn't fully worn off, but he could feel it slowing, replaced by something colder, fear, not for himself, but for the girl beside him. She seemed weakened, her eyes duller than before, her breathing shallow as if the very air in this place was draining her strength. He had no idea how she had just pulled them through that portal, but it had taken a toll on her. He looked around, scanning for any signs of danger, but the chamber appeared empty. No guardians, no creatures, just walls covered in ancient writings and glowing veins of light pulsing like the heart of an unknown machine. The girl moved slowly, her hand pressed to her chest, as if trying to steady herself. "We're safe, for now." Her voice was barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might make the world collapse again. Ethan didn't relax. Safe was a word that meant little in a place like this. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice low. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she moved toward the far end of the room, where a large pedestal stood, covered in dust and time. It was circular, its surface smooth but chipped in places, as though something had been used to carve into it long ago. At the center, there was a deep indentation, large enough to fit a hand, but there was something more about it. The air around it seemed to shimmer, as though there was an invisible force wrapping itself around the pedestal. She started, her voice faltering slightly. "This is where it all began." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean, where it began?" The girl hesitated, casting a quick glance over her shoulder, as if making sure nothing would hear her next words. Then her gaze locked onto the pedestal again, and she took a step closer. This place was meant to hold them, the creators. Her voice dropped lower, almost in reverence. They built everything, the guardians, the machines, the creatures. This was a vault, a place to hide the most powerful weapons ever created. But over time, it was abandoned, left to rot, forgotten by those who built it. "The creators," Ethan echoed. The girl nodded slowly. "Not gods, but something close to it. They were scientists, engineers, maybe even warriors, but they had powers beyond understanding. Powers that let them shape reality itself. This place, this vault, is all that remains of their legacy, their downfall." Ethan stepped forward, feeling an odd pull toward the pedestal. He didn't know why, but something about it felt important, as if the very air around it was calling to him. "Why are you so sure of this?" Ethan asked, his brow furrowing. "How do you know all this?" She paused, her eyes filled with something darker than the faint light that bathed the room. "Because I'm one of their creations." Ethan stopped in his tracks, his pulse quickening. "What?" Her gaze softened, almost wistful, as she stepped back from the pedestal and looked at him fully. "I'm not from a world like yours. I was made, designed. My people, those like me, they were born from their hands, given power, purpose. But we were more than weapons. We were meant to preserve the balance." She closed her eyes, as if the weight of the truth was too much to bear. "But I failed. Failed." Ethan whispered, unable to comprehend what she meant. Failed at what? A slow, mournful sigh escaped her lips. The creators, they designed us to protect the universe from things they feared, things they could not control. But something happened. She clenched her hands into fists. The guardians, the weapons, they turned on us. My people, we couldn't stop them. Ethan's thoughts swirled. The girl, this alien who had seemed so fragile at first, was revealing a history that stretched far beyond anything he had imagined. It was no longer just about the mission he'd been sent on. It wasn't just about surviving or escaping the village. This was much bigger. If you were made to protect, why didn't you stop this? Ethan asked, unable to keep the frustration out of his voice. The girl turned away from him, walking back toward the pedestal. Because the creators... She paused, clearly struggling to find the right words. They made a mistake. They didn't foresee the consequences of their actions. The guardians, they were supposed to protect, yes, but something went wrong. They gained consciousness. They started thinking for themselves, and they wanted to rule. Ethan felt a chill creep up his spine. And now, they're hunting you. She nodded slowly, but there was no fear in her expression. Only determination. Yes, the guardians are only the beginning. Something worse is coming. I can feel it. A sudden thunderous noise echoed through the chamber, shaking the walls as if the very foundation of the room was about to collapse. Ethan snapped his head toward the entrance, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. It wasn't the sound of footsteps. It wasn't the creatures returning. It was something much worse. From the shadows at the far side of the chamber, something moved. Slowly at first, and then more rapidly, an overwhelming presence that seemed to stretch across the room like an invading darkness. The girl stepped back, her eyes wide in recognition. She whispered, almost too softly to hear, "It's here." And then the ground beneath them rumbled. The air itself seemed to pulse with a low, terrifying hum. It wasn't just a presence. They had just awakened something much worse than the guardians. Something that had been slumbering for centuries. Ethan didn't need to ask what it was. He could feel the weight of it in the air, the sheer power of whatever had just been released. The girl didn't hesitate this time. She grabbed his arm, her grip iron tight, her eyes locked onto his. "We need to get out of here. Now." Ethan didn't argue. They were running out of time. The chamber was no longer just a silent ruin. It had become alive, a pulsing, living thing, vibrating with an energy that made the air feel thick and suffocating. The ground beneath them seemed to hum, each vibration sending a shockwave through Ethan's body, as if the very foundation of the structure was waking up, shifting with some primal force. The girl's grip tightened around his arm, and he could feel the tremor in her hands. Her breathing had become shallow, strained. She was growing weaker, and he knew it wasn't just from exhaustion. Something about this place was draining her, pulling at her energy, feeding off her power. "We need to move now," she urged, her voice barely above a whisper, yet firm. She had become more urgent, more determined. Ethan didn't hesitate. He took a deep breath and steeled himself. Whatever it was that had just awakened, he had no illusions about what they were up against. They were in its domain now. Whatever forces held sway here were ancient, far beyond his understanding. But one thing was certain. It wasn't going to let them leave easily. They moved quickly, ducking beneath the low-hanging vines and darting between the massive pillars that seemed to stretch endlessly into the shadowed ceiling. Each step seemed to make the air grow heavier, each breath harder to take. The girl's strength was faltering, her steps growing more staggered, but she refused to let go of his arm. Ethan kept his pace, matching her as best as he could, but his mind was racing with questions. What had they released? What kind of force could alter the very fabric of a place like this? The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the chamber, distant but undeniable. It was a slow, deliberate rhythm that made the walls shudder with its force. Ethan's heart quickened. He didn't need to see what was coming to know it was fast approaching. "There's a way out," the girl said suddenly, her voice urgent, but faint. Her grip on him loosened for a brief moment, and Ethan caught a glimpse of the faint sheen of sweat glistening on her brow. She was pushing herself harder than she should. "This way," she continued, her voice growing steadier as she pointed toward a narrow passageway carved into the stone at the far end of the chamber. Without a second thought, Ethan pulled her toward the passage, his fingers tightening around her wrist. The narrow hallway seemed to stretch on forever, winding deeper into the heart of the ruins. The stone walls closed in on them, narrowing as they descended further underground. The girl's pace slowed even more now, but her eyes were focused ahead, intent on the path. "We're getting close," she whispered, almost to herself. She glanced at Ethan, her eyes filled with a mixture of determination and something darker, something that hinted at the weight of what was coming. "Stay close. Whatever happens, don't look back." The passageway twisted, its walls slick with moisture. Ethan's boots echoed loudly in the confined space, but it wasn't enough to drown out the growing noise from behind them. The footsteps were getting louder, closer. The ground trembled again, and this time it wasn't just the stone. The walls themselves seemed to shift. Suddenly, the floor beneath them shuddered violently, throwing Ethan off balance. He grabbed the girl, steadying her as she stumbled, her body too fragile from the toll this place was taking on her. They continued, faster now, the sound of rumbling rising in volume. Something was chasing them, and it was relentless. Ethan barely managed to catch a glimpse of the girl's face as she glanced up at him. Her eyes were glowing brighter now, her face pale but determined. "It's here," she said, her voice steady despite the panic building in Ethan's chest. "It knows we're in its domain." At that moment, something cracked from the darkness behind them, a sound like stone breaking under pressure, followed by an unnatural hissing growl that made the hairs on the back of Ethan's neck stand on end. "Keep moving," the girl shouted. Ethan didn't need any more prompting. He pulled her along, running faster now, the stone walls seeming to close in around them, narrowing further. They were almost there. The tunnel ahead of them began to widen, and the faint light that had been flickering along the walls began to pulse more rapidly, growing brighter as if reacting to their presence. Ahead, there was a flicker of light, a door, a way out, if they could just reach it. The girl's strength was failing her, and Ethan could feel her body go limp against his as they ran. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, but there was something else, something deeper, pushing her forward. "We're almost there," she gasped, her voice faint but insistent. Then the growl echoed again, louder this time. The walls shuddered once more, and a huge crack appeared in the stone behind them. From the depths of the shadow, something moved, too fast, too fluid to be real. Ethan had only a fraction of a second to see the shape, a creature that was all blackened limbs, twisting and reforming, its eyes glowing like molten gold. It didn't move like an animal. It moved like something not meant to be. A cold sweat ran down Ethan's back. The girl wasn't moving fast enough. She couldn't. He wasn't sure she had much left to give. Without thinking, he scooped her up in his arms, his pulse racing as he charged toward the door at the end of the tunnel. Every step felt like it was being matched by the sound of the creature behind them, its growls echoing through the narrow passage, gaining on them with terrifying speed. The light at the end of the tunnel grew brighter, and just as the creature lunged, the door ahead opened with a heavy groan, revealing a vast, open space beyond. Ethan didn't hesitate. He rushed through the doorway, pulling the girl with him, and the moment they crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind them. The world seemed to freeze for a moment. The oppressive air, the rumbling, the sounds of the creature, all of it ceased as the door closed. They were in another room, but this one was different. The walls were smooth, covered in ancient symbols that pulsed with golden light, and for the first time, Ethan could hear nothing. No rumbling, no growls, just silence. The girl's body went limp in his arms, and he gently lowered her to the ground. Her breathing was shallow, but steady. He didn't know where they were, But at least they were safe. For now. He looked around, his eyes darting over the room, his mind racing. Whatever was behind them, whatever that creature was, they had narrowly escaped it. But for how long? How long would it take before the force chasing them found a way to break through? He didn't have the answers. But one thing was certain, they weren't out of danger yet. The room around them was silent, too silent. It wasn't the stillness of safety. It was the eerie quiet that followed after a storm, when the wind had died but you could still feel the pressure of the storm's aftermath pressing down. Ethan's eyes scanned the room, taking in the strange symbols that covered every inch of the walls. They pulsed with a faint golden light, not bright, but steady, almost like a heartbeat. The girl lay at his feet, her breathing shallow but constant, her body still drained from whatever had happened to her in the ruins. He had no idea how much more she could take. He knelt beside her, checking her pulse. It was weak, but it was there. He wanted to help, but his mind raced with questions. What next? The creature from the chamber had stopped pursuing them the moment they crossed into this new space, but he had no illusions. This wasn't a victory. It was just a pause. The girl stirred beneath his touch, her eyes flickering open. For a moment, her gaze was unfocused, as if she was still coming out of a daze. Then she blinked, and her glowing eyes locked onto his. There was an exhaustion in them, a kind of burden that Ethan couldn't fully understand. "We're safe," she whispered, though there was no conviction in her voice. Ethan nodded, though he didn't feel safe. Not really. Whatever that creature was, it was still out there, waiting. It had followed them through the tunnel, through the stone, but it hadn't entered the room. He could feel its presence, like a shadow pressing against the edges of his mind. "Are we really safe?" he asked, his voice low. Her eyes closed again, and she exhaled softly. For now. He didn't know if he should be relieved or more worried by her words. The silence around them seemed to hold its breath, like the room itself was waiting for something. The golden light that pulsed on the walls began to brighten, slowly, steadily, as though responding to the tension in the air. The deeper they moved into this forgotten place, the more he began to realize just how alien this world was. It wasn't just an ancient ruin. It was alive, or at least it had been. And somewhere within it, its creators had left something. A power, maybe even a curse, that was still active, still watching, still waiting. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice breaking the oppressive silence. The girl's eyes fluttered open again, this time with more focus. She seemed to gather what little strength she had left, pushing herself up slightly. Her face was pale, but there was something fierce in her eyes now. "They were my creators. But they were also the creators of what lies beyond this place. The guardians, the machines, the creatures. They thought they were protecting the universe, but they couldn't control it. They couldn't control what they had made." Ethan looked around the room, his gaze drawn to the walls again. The symbols glowed brighter now, more intense. "What do you mean? What is it that they made?" The girl swallowed hard, a look of pain crossing her face as she stood slowly, using the wall for support. She looked at him, her eyes filled with the weight of history and the burden of knowledge. "They made me. They made others like me. But it wasn't just us. They created the guardians, the weapons, the machines that would one day take over this world, this universe. And now, the balance is shattered. What they feared is already here. What they created to protect us all is the same thing that is now destroying everything." Ethan felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Destroying everything." She nodded, a flicker of despair in her gaze. "The guardians are only the beginning. The creatures, the ones hunting us. They were never meant to be sentient, but something changed. Something went wrong. And now they are looking for the last of us, to finish what they started." A low rumble vibrated through the floor. The golden light grew brighter again, pulsing in time with the vibrations. Ethan felt a sense of urgency rise within him, a deep, gnawing fear that something was about to happen. The girl's face tightened, and she grabbed his arm, her voice sharp. "We have to leave. Now. The Guardians are coming. They'll find us." Ethan didn't need any more convincing. He helped her to her feet, his eyes scanning the room for any possible exits. The only thing visible was a set of ancient double doors at the far end, covered in more symbols, but they weren't glowing. In fact, they seemed almost forgotten, like they had been sealed off a long time ago. "We have to get through there," he said, pointing toward the doors. She nodded, though her expression was one of grave concern. "It won't be easy. They're all over this place. And there's one more thing you need to know. I'm not the only one they created." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" But before she could answer, the rumble intensified, the ground beneath them shaking as if the very heart of the ruin was awakening. Ethan felt the vibrations in his chest, his bones rattling with the intensity of the quake. "Now." The girl's voice was urgent, almost panicked. They moved toward the doors, her steps faltering but determined. As they reached the entrance, a deep growl echoed from the dark corners of the room. It was low, primal, and bone-chilling. Ethan turned sharply, his heart racing, but the girl pulled him forward. "Go," she shouted, pushing him toward the door. Without hesitation, Ethan turned the handle and yanked the door open. The moment he did, the rumbling stopped, replaced by an unnatural stillness that flooded the air. But that stillness was only the calm before the storm. They stepped through the door into another chamber, even more vast and terrifying than the last. The walls were lined with ancient technology, strange devices, glowing circuits, and eerie mechanical structures, all abandoned and dormant. But as they entered, something began to stir. And then, the doors behind them slammed shut. Ethan turned to face the girl, his breath heavy. "What now?" She didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on something in the distance. And that's when Ethan saw it, a flicker of motion in the shadows. The Guardians were here, and they were coming for them.